Ciao a tutti, sono Rossi Wolf 89 e siamo alla nostra raccolta, diciamo, ricerca 3 giorni alla settimana delle nostre serie TV preferite che le ho messe tutte nella raccolta sia su Twitch che su YouTube. Quindi ragazzi, attivate le notifiche e seguitemi sia per le serie TV che per tutti gli altri contenuti videoludici, sia per PC, Xbox, PS5 e Switch, tutte le piattaforme. Allora, oggi tratteremo di un tema che diciamo in gran parte tutto il mondo conoscerà, in gran parte, praticamente tutti conosceranno. eh, il disastro di Chernobyl. O Chernobyl è una miniserie TV di 5-6 puntate, mi sembra, che durano dall'ora, ore 10, un quarto, che trattano del tema dell'esplosione nucleare avvenuta a Chernobyl durante il periodo dell'invasione sovietica dell'86. Qui ripercorreremo sia la fusione del nocciolo che tutte le vicende, le piccole storielle, i piccoli avvenimenti avvenuti intorno a questa base nucleare, le le persone, insomma, che hanno evitato con molta fatica di far esplodere il nocciolo in modo da non espandere la propria radiazione verso tutta l'Europa. Allora, vi faccio vedere direttamente il video, non vi spiego altro perché sapete tutti di che cosa si tratta. Poi una miniserie nel 2019 di poche puntate, quindi
Perspective is a powerful tool for storytelling in film and TV. You can control perspective with the writing through what stories you choose to focus on and how you tell them. You can control it with the cinematography and how you frame an event visually. And you can control it in the edit with where you place the focus of the scene. One of the things that makes the Chernobyl miniseries so powerful is its use of perspective. Let's look at how the creators of Chernobyl, from the writers to the editors, shaped the perspective of each episode, scene, and the show as a whole, and how that impacts the story. This video is brought to you by Mubi. What is perspective in film and TV? I'm not talking about point of view shots where we see what the character sees, though that is one tool that helps establish the perspective of a scene. Perspective is the vantage point from which the audience experiences the scene emotionally and dramatically. I'll show some of the tools Chernobyl uses to establish its perspective as we go along. Chernobyl chooses a more subjective approach to telling its story, using the perspective of individuals in a lot of scenes. Subjective here doesn't mean less factual, just that the goal is to tell the story as those characters experienced it. Instead of trying to give the clearest possible account, the account is more personal, meant to emotionally convey the event as it was experienced. A perfect example of this is episode 4. The Chernobyl area cleanup was a massive project spanning years and involving thousands of people. But in order to tell this story, the series chooses to mostly focus on one group of 3 men performing one job, and then within that group, the experience of one young man.
Awaken to a world of wonder in Final Fantasy XIV Online.
Sarebbe da provare anche questo.
Take it easy and play your way. Whether it's fishing,
It's extremely difficult to make a story about many people emotionally impactful. Psychologically, humans are more likely to empathize with individuals than with groups, so focusing the story on an individual allows for maximum emotional impact. All you need then is a few visual clues to show the audience that the experience of this one individual can be multiplied by thousands. In taking a more subjective perspective like this, you'll sacrifice some information. In the show, we don't learn many details about all the other jobs that were being done, but it allows us to be more emotionally invested in the characters the show does focus on.
I thought, well, that's it, Bacho. You put a bullet in someone. You're not you anymore. You'll never be you again. But then you wake up the next morning and you're still you.
It's not just important to choose between subjective and objective perspectives for your story or scene. If you choose a more subjective perspective, whose perspective you choose for each scene is incredibly important. Throughout the first episode, the perspective shifts in each scene, usually to the person in that scene that is encountering the disaster for the first time. We see the disaster first from the perspective of the plant workers, as they deal with the initial fallout. From the political character's perspective, as they learn about the disaster, as the firefighters arrive on site, the show shifts to the perspective of an individual firefighter as he's awoken and arrives at the disaster. But when the firefighters are taken to the hospital, we see that scene from the perspective of a single nurse being awoken and seeing the effects of the disaster for the first time. This puts us in the perspective of each character at the moment of maximum surprise. It's part of what gives the first episode such a sustained feeling of tension. While the perspective of each scene varies, the primary perspective of the story as a whole is Legasov's. While many scenes are not from his perspective, most of the scenes he's in are framed in his perspective. The show establishes this by beginning with his suicide and him recording himself telling the story.
What does that mean? No one knows. It doesn't matter.
Showing us this event largely through the eyes of someone who eventually killed himself because of it sets the tone throughout the show. When we see his reactions to everything that is happening, we know what it's leading towards. The show is, in effect, increasing suspense by showing a reaction and then showing what caused that reaction. This is a technique the show will use again to dramatize exposition like this.
Page 3, the section on casualties. A fireman was severely burned on his hand by a chunk of smooth black mineral on the ground outside the reactor building. Smooth black mineral. Graphite. There's graphite on the ground.
This exposition is dramatically powerful because we saw Legasov's reaction to it just a few minutes earlier.
All right, Professor, they're ready. Professor Legasov?
You can also use perspective to make the revelation of information feel more meaningful. You do this by showing it to the audience from the perspective of the person that the information would be most meaningful to. If you want to dramatize the firefighter's medical situation, construct those scenes from the perspective of one of the firefighter's wives trying to get to her husband and seeing him deteriorate.
Stop moving! Get off him! You're hurting him! You can't be in here. What's happening to him?
If you want to show how far spread the disaster is, show this information being discovered by someone who is far away and who understands the implications of the disaster and how far it's reaching.
Ain't never runken. Leak?
No.
It would have gone off before. It's coming from outside.
Perspective is established in the writing, but the entire production team must work together to create those perspectives and actually sell the effect to the audience. Let's go back to the firefighter and his wife. In the scene where she and the audience sees his condition for the first time, we do see him, but notice how most of what the camera focuses on is her face. This shot is an example of using cinematography to establish perspective. If you pay attention to the cinematography of the show, especially in the first episode, you'll notice how much time is spent on close-up shots of characters reacting to things. A shot like this of the firefighter reacting to his comrade's burn is dramatically just as important as actually showing the burn. In some ways, it's more important than actually seeing what's going on, and throughout episode 1, we hardly see the details of the actual disaster. This plays an important role in keeping us in these characters' perspectives. The characters cannot see clearly everything that's happening, so we, the audience, will not see an objective view of what's happening that they do not have access to. The shot used to establish the Chernobyl area before the explosion at the beginning of the show is not a nice wide shot of the power plant, the focus of the show. It's some apartment buildings in Pripyat. We focus on a character and experience the explosion from her perspective as she would have. In the control room, slow motion, sound design, and tight constricting cinematography keep us focused on the operators and their emotional state and reaction. A wide, steady, calm, objective camera would pull us away from the emotional state of the characters and out of their perspective. It's not literally seeing what the characters see that puts us in their perspective. When we can see their faces and reactions and connect with their emotions, when the camera feels like it's in the room with them, we're experiencing the scene from their perspective. In a scene like this, when we see a shot of Legasov by himself in the frame, boxed in and framed by bodies around him, we're in his perspective. If the cinematographer had wanted to stay in a more objective perspective, they could have shown a wider shot, more clearly displaying him with the characters around him. This personal, individual perspective is consistently maintained throughout most of the first episode. Only rarely and quite far into the episode do we get occasional, slow, steady wide shots revealing more of the disaster itself. And we only see these types of shots as characters themselves gain these perspectives. An explosion, disaster, or monster by itself is not very scary. It's relative to characters we can sympathize with that these things become terrifying. Look at this scene from Deepwater Horizon.
Bene ragazzi, abbiamo visto questo piccolo riassunto non finito, però insomma vi dà un'idea della serie TV, dell'argomento storico trattato. Ciao a tutti e buona visione. Ciao da Rossi Wolf 89.